Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the session in which we have the presentations of by the winners of the Issid Early Career Award. To be closer. Okay. This is an award which is given usually to one promising researcher within 7 years of their PhD. This time round, we've had a good year, so we've actually got 2 award winners. And there was a grand plan that we would have each one introduced by their PhD supervisor, but I think a supervisor is currently missing, does anybody see Thomas Chamorro Peruzic anywhere? No. Okay, so I will introduce our first winner in his absence. Our 2 winners, I'll tell you their names, which are displayed there anyway, Sophie von Stumm and Christian Candler. Sophie is going to speak first about her research, so I'll give you a bit of an introduction to her. She's currently working at Goldsmiths, University of London, which is also where she did her PhD, completed in 2010. She's also the current holder of the Isaac Memorial Scholarship, which is nice. She's also previously held an ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council Fellowship with us in Edinburgh, which was very nice for us. In terms of research achievements, I hesitate to talk about numbers of publications because the CV I have is a few months old, and our 2 winners are both publishing at such a rate that my information must be out of date. But I have here that she currently has 20, or did have a few months ago, 20 publications in peer-reviewed journals, of which she's first author of 16. And these papers have appeared in journals such as Psychological Bulletin, Intelligence, and Psychology and Aging, so high-profile journals. And she's also co-editor of the very well-regarded recent Handbook of Individual Differences, which many of us have on our bookshelves. So obviously a very worthy award winner. And I'll now just hand you over to Sophie to give her talk, which is going to be on intelligence and lifespan development.
Well, thank you very much for this impromptu introduction. I shall consider myself the winner who didn't need an introduction, really. From now on, I am actually not really going to talk about intelligence across the entire lifespan. Instead, I'll start with something that comes from the very beginning of my research in individual differences, looking at the consequences of individual differences in intelligence, and then I'll go back to the beginning and look at cognitive development in children. But before I start, I thought it was important to express my gratitude for this award. I am really extremely honored. This is very exciting for me, and I thank the society for valuing my contribution to research as such important that I get this award. And I thank the committee for selecting me. And I thank all of you for being here and listening to me. And there are 5 men in particular I want to thank. Only one of them is here. But I'll talk through them nonetheless, and you can tell them afterwards what I said. The first one is my very wonderful PhD supervisor, who was the most generous and supportive supervisor any student could want for a PhD. He was particularly good in teaching me independent learning. I think we might see an aspect of that today. And then there's Adrian Firmingham, who unfortunately can't be here today, but who was somebody who taught me savvy in academia, I'd say. The first conference I ever went to was in 2007, the Issid, by this very society in Gießen. And on the opening reception, I chatted to Adrian, and he explained to me the purpose of conferences. And he said there are only 3 reasons to go: jobs, networking, and sex. And age is the moderating variable. Somebody who was even more important for the research field I'm working in right now is Ian Deary, because he was the first one to introduce me to intelligence. And then he introduced me to cognitive epidemiology, And then he tricked me into doing cognitive aging research. So he's still very much an inspiration for most of my work. And then there's finally somebody who is actually here in flesh and body, and that is Phil Ackerman. And I spent an amazing 3 months in the Ackerman and Canfer lab in Atlanta. What I learned there was basically the experimental side to individual differences research, because he led me away from looking at pre-collected longitudinal data sets and showed me how to actually get people into the lab and make them fill in new questionnaires and measures and try to investigate psychometric structures. And then the latest addition to my list of mentors would be Robert Plomin, because I am just about to transition a little bit into behavior genetics, and he has taken the time and patience to teach me about that. So I thank all of them, but I think most of all of you who have had a moment or two in my time in the society to argue with me about the important questions of individual differences. And with that, I'll move on to the consequences of individual differences in intelligence. And I'll focus on social status attainment as an outcome variable, on health, and then on marital status. And then I'll give you a little bit of a methodological talk on change in IQ and how to model that, or what I think would be a good idea of modeling that. And then I look at the causes of individual differences in that change, again with a set of variables. So this is taken very much from the founding fathers of cognitive epidemiology, Ian Deary and David Batty, and it is basically a model of how we think that intelligence would be associated with health outcomes in life, and in particular with life expectancy and mortality. And as you can see here, there's one path that focuses on socioeconomic status in childhood, and then pre-morbid IQ, that is simply IQ that has not been affected by disease or other negative influences throughout the lifespan, and socioeconomic position in adulthood. And the idea is that these three variables are associated with mortality. Now, I personally don't do mortality research, not yet at least, but I looked at the path before that, and when I do that, I use mostly longitudinal data sets. Some of them are from Scotland, not all of them, but one of my favorites, or one of which I've worked with most, is the Aberdeen children of the 1950s. It's a sample of 12,000 children from the Aberdeen area in Scotland, and they were born in the 1950s, precisely between 1950 and 1956. And we have data from their birth records where they have been assessed on IQ at age 11, and then they were followed up at age 46 to 50 with a postal questionnaire. And there was a wealth of information collected at the follow-up 35 years after the IQ assessment, and I'll be talking through some of those. So this is the basic, principle model, I guess, that we are working with in this area. So the assumption is that you have childhood intelligence, which is associated with social background variables. You have education, which mediates in part the effects of childhood IQ and socioeconomic status in childhood onto your outcome variable, in this case, socioeconomic status attainment at midlife. But on top of that, intelligence and social background are thought to have direct effects beyond the mediating variable of education. And if we fit this with data, we get these path estimates that pretty much confirm the theory. So this is fitted only to men. We explain about 50% of the variance. And what you can see very clearly here is that intelligence is most strongly associated with educational attainment at midlife, which mediates the effects of both social background and IQ in childhood onto socioeconomic status. But both early life variables also have very strong direct effects. This is something we do not necessarily see for all midlife outcomes. It's something very specific to socioeconomic status attainment because of its very close relationship with how smart you are and where you've come from, basically. Now, if we extend this, we can look at three other variables in this model: disease and injury prevention, disease and injury management, and psychiatric illness. And for the sake of argument and simplicity, I'd summarize those three and call them health. So what is the association between childhood socioeconomic status and childhood IQ with health outcomes in midlife? And this is some work I've been doing with a colleague of mine who's now at UCL, Gareth Hager-Johnson. And we basically followed the same idea as before, just that we changed the outcome variable. And we looked at self-rated health. I'll tell you this, it's a single item self-rated health measure, and says how good are you feeling, basically. But it has shown to have great reliability and validity. And what you can see now is that intelligence does not have a direct path anymore on health or variance in health outcomes in midlife. That does not mean it's not important. It just means that its effects are largely mediated by the other variables in the model, most notably here by education. Parental socioeconomic status does have a direct effect, but it's very, very small. So one could argue, again, largely mediated by education. We should extend this by one more variable or one more association. What does it look like if we include socioeconomic status in adulthood? It looks like this. Our outcome variable here is mental health. Again, it's a self-report measure of how well are you feeling, just with a little bit more items and with a focus on psychological distress. It's a pre-assessment for risk of depression, basically. And what you see here is you have socioeconomic status and childhood IQ again, and their effects are largely mediated by education onto adult socioeconomic status, which in turn is the only variable with a direct effect on mental health. And you can see that it's negative here. The interpretation is the lower your socioeconomic status, the greater your mental health problems. And with that, I'm done with health, basically. Cognitive epidemiology, it's a fascinating field. However, I think considering health alone as an outcome variable of individual differences in intelligence in childhood is cutting the story short. So I'm proposing an extension, and I call it cognitive demography. And I thought we should look at outcome variables like how do people live besides their health status and their job. And one of the most important variables that come in addition, I would say, is who do you live with? Who are you surrounded by? What is your family structure? And so I've started to look at marital status as an outcome variable, or outcome variable is perhaps an overstatement, in relation to childhood IQ. And I'm just very briefly showing you the numbers here without the funky statistics. What you have here is average IQ values. Again, this is from the Aberdeen children of the 1950s, and you have 5 categories of marital status: never married, married, widowed, divorced, and separated. And the 2 lines that I think we should pay attention to are the married ones, with 106 on average in both men and women, and divorced people who in men have 102 on average and in women 104. This is significant. It's the only significant difference between the marital categories. It holds up after adjusting for socioeconomic status differences. It clearly suggests that there's something in childhood IQ, a small disadvantage in childhood IQ that carries over, and that is reflected not only in health outcomes or status attainment or educational attainment, but it is also reflected in marital stability, not necessarily in finding a spouse, but in marital stability, definitely. And with that, I hope I've convinced you, even though I have a feeling that was probably not very hard to do, that intelligence is really important for life outcomes, and quite a range so. So let's talk about where does this intelligence thing come from? What is it in childhood? What does it look like? What's its nature? And this is where I want to go into change. What is change in IQ? So I think change in IQ is very well captured in latent growth curve models, which basically partition the variance that you have in IQ assessments, and you need 3 of those or a few more, preferably, over time. It partitions this variance in IQ that is assessed at different time points into different compartments. One of them is the variance that is stable over time, so to speak, the starting point in IQ. And then there's a chunk of variance that embodies the change in IQ that we see happening over time. And once you do that, you can compute latent growth trajectories that show you how people develop over time on average. I'll go into this in a bit more detail because the rest of this talk is based on these sort of models. So you have the intercept on the one hand. You have a data set here with 9 IQ assessments starting at the age of 2. Then age 3, 4, 7, 9, 10, 12, 14, and 16 years. So 9 times assessed IQ from infancy through adolescence. You extract the variance that is common to all of these assessments. That's the variance that is stable. So that's the intercept with the factor loadings restricted to 1. The second factor is the slope. It symbolizes linear change, or it's the variance of linear change over time in these intelligence measures. So the slope is defined in terms of the absolute time periods between the assessment waves. So it's defined at 0, it starts at 0, that is where the intercept is defined, and then it moves up according to the number of years that have passed between each assessment wave. Now, if you do not have only linear change in your variances, you can fit a third term or a fourth term, even a fifth if you feel like it. I shall stick to a third term, a quadratic term, which would summarize systematic change in the IQ variances that is not linear, and that would be reflected in a growth trajectory in terms of acceleration or deceleration of the growth curve. Factor loadings of a quadratic term would be the square of the slope. So, that much about the theory. Now here's the data I'm working with. It's a twins early development study. It's held at the IOP in London. They have about 8,000 twin pairs now that have been followed up from age 2 to 16 on IQ and several other things, but I'm particularly interested in IQ. They were born between 1994 and 1996 in England and Wales. The sample is representative of the United Kingdom population. IQ was assessed at each age by at least 2 tests, but using different methods. So at the ages 2, 3, and 4, it was parent-administered IQ tests. At the ages 7, 8, and 9, it was telephone-based. And since the age of 12, it is web-based assessments. So you have a bunch of different tests at each age, and you get different scores. Basically, what you do, or I did in this case, was run a factor analysis at each time, extract G, and transform that into IQ points, 100 on average with a standard deviation of 15, which in itself is not very meaningful, obviously, because it's normed at each age, but this is just to make the results clearer and the interpretation of the scores easier. I'll show you what I mean in a second. So what I did then was I fitted these models to this very large data set, and the nice thing about the twin design is you can use that in so many different ways. So you can estimate heritability, yes, but you also can just replicate your own models because you have these siblings that are not, you have the ones that are identical, okay, genetically speaking at least, but you also have the dizygotic twins, so you can just start exploring your models in one sample and fit it to a second one and compare the estimates and see how solid it is and how easily you can get a misfit in this. So if you fit this model, it turns out that there are 3 latent growth factors in the TEDS data from age 2 to 16. And not surprisingly, the intercept mean is 100, because that's what we normed it to be like. And the slope and the quadratic term are 0 on average. However, the important parameter that we want to see in such a model is the variance in slope and quadratic term and in the intercept. So in the intercept, the question is, are people different when they start in IQ? And in the slope and the quadratic term, are they different in the extent to which they change over time in IQ? And once we can say yes to these 2 questions, we can start trying to explain those differences and say, why do some gain, why do some lose in IQ over time? And this is what we're doing now. So that's the first variable I wanted to look at for this, was socioeconomic status. Do children differ in their cognitive development according to socioeconomic status? It seems like a simple yes would suffice, but most previous research in this area has just looked at time point estimates. So they say your IQ at age 5 is associated with your socioeconomic status of origin, but nobody looked at the extent to which it affects actual growth in IQ over time, and especially not in a representative sample like this. So the line that you see here is the growth trajectory based on the overall TED sample. Again, mean of 100, no slope, no quadratic term. This is the high SES group. These are 1,120 twins. It's only one randomly selected twin per pair. It's half the sample that we're working with here. 1,120 twins of the lowest socioeconomic status. And just to break socioeconomic status down briefly, it's mothers and fathers' occupational status, their highest educational attainment, and income. It's a pretty solid composite score of all important aspects that we would work with. And what you can see very clearly that compared to the overall sample, these children start a little bit higher and they gain over time. By comparison, these is the lowest SES group. Same size, just at the other end of the SES composite. And what we see then is at age 2, the difference is 5 points. By age 16, it's 10. So socioeconomic status differences are not only reflected in stable variance over time, but it very much influences to what extent you change and in which direction. The second question, and we obviously would have to ask, is what's with the genes? Now, luckily we have twins, so we can estimate the heritability of change in IQ. And we do that by running a decomposition of those latent growth factors that we extracted before, and we look at the extent to which they're explained by genetic influences, by shared environmental influences, or unique environmental influences. And what you get when you do that is this. And this is the heritability of the intercept. So this is the heritability of basically children's IQ in average in infancy or at age 2. It's at 0.22, it's 22%. It is absolutely in line with what we know from the literature. Heritability of IQ in young children is comparatively low. It goes up as we grow older, but in early life it is that. Now, if we look at the heritability of change, what we then see is it is heritable at about 30%, with about 70% being influenced by environmental factors, shared and unique environmental, and perhaps it is worth noting here that the shared environment has a particularly strong effect that is relatively unusual to find in the literature. It does suggest somehow that change in IQ is mostly influenced by the environment, whereas stability in IQ over time is likely to be more strongly determined by genes. The last set of variables I wanted to look at were the early life factors. And these are all sorts of nasty things you can think of. For example, mother's alcohol consumption during pregnancy. So what you see here is the non-alcohol group and the alcohol group. The differences are small. There's no difference in the rate of change or in the curve over time. It's about not even 1 IQ point that's stably the same. I have to say with this is adjusted for socioeconomic status differences. Because if you look at this and you think about the socioeconomic status graph before, the differences were massive compared to this. But it's because we have adjusted that already. So basically, the difference that you see here is on top of other socioeconomic status differences that we would consider when looking at growth. This is smoking. Something we start seeing here for the first time is that the effect of the early life factors unfolds over time. Again, this is adjusted for socioeconomic status influences. So at the very beginning, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between children whose mother smoked during pregnancy or did not smoke during pregnancy. But as we go towards adolescence, we see that the gap widens a little bit. I'm not saying it's just 1 IQ point. We can argue if that's important or not. But it is a long-lasting effect from something that seems to be very small at the very beginning of life. And I would like to say with this, we have data on how much people smoked and how much they drank. This effect is observable even with less than 5 cigarettes per day. For non-smokers, this doesn't seem like a lot, but yeah, once you are a smoking mother, more than 5, it's really bad. It's just 5 cigarettes a day. Breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is one where we see the largest effect so far. Again, this is adjusted for socioeconomic status differences. And what we see very clearly here is that not breastfeeding causes a disadvantage compared to being breastfed. It's not that breastfed children gain more in intelligence, it's just the others seem to lose. And here again, we have a smaller difference in the beginning and then it widens to about 3 IQ points as we move into adolescence. I'd wrap this up here. Individual differences in intelligence are important in all aspects of life. And I think we can see that very clearly in the context of cognitive epidemiology, and perhaps in the extension in terms of cognitive demography. There's a second point I would like to make based on this, even though it may seem as if I'm overstepping the results we have here. Intelligence is neither fixed nor innate, and not that anyone ever assumed that in principle, but sometimes it seems we pay much more attention to the genetic underpinnings of individual differences, at least when we look at research efforts, than at the environmental differences that there are. And this shows very clearly how important the environment is, even for the development of traits that we generally assume to be highly heritable and very strongly influenced by genetic factors. And with that, I have a few questions for the next time that I stand up here. That's the ambition to answer them in the future of my research. So the point would be to identify what environments do make a difference for intelligence. And beyond that, how can we ensure that more people, and perhaps in particular children, have a chance to benefit from these environments? And with that, I would like to thank the people who employ me, which is always very kind of them, and my funding bodies. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.